Chapter 12 The Akean Wine Festival. Kino Amark. The carriage that Wind sent was already waiting for me outside the cottage. I took one quick look at the mirror before heading out. My eyes were sunken due to my lack of sleep, and to my horror, they were also slightly bloodshot, but there was nothing I could do about them now. Kino was already at school. He told me that today was the Akean Wine Festival, and I had to smile at him. Of course, I knew what today was. Kino lost interest in going to the Akean Wine Festival 3 moon turns ago when it dawned on him that his power was not going to manifest. The truth was scathingly harsh, and to a boy, it meant incessant bullying from his classmates. Don't worry, Kino, I thought. After today, if my plan works out, we'll go home quietly tonight, pack our things, and start traveling to Nivetan. I decided that there was no place more suitable for him than Nivetan. After all, he is a Nivan. I could not bear the pain of remembering Timbuktu, but I should at least deal with this one day at a time. I was sure they would fade as Kino and I started anew at Nivetan. The soldier opened the carriage door, and I sat quietly inside. It was going to be another bumpy ride, but it was not going to wipe the smile from my face. Since today was the Akean Wine Festival, Wind would be preoccupied, and my plan could actually work. I slept the entire ride to the Kanelan Palace. Only the resounding trumpets, their cacophony piercing through the carriage walls, roused me from my slumber. The carriage stopped, and I looked outside before alighting. The palace's main streets were filled with carriages, and it was already quite difficult to squeeze in. There were banners all around, and yet the main yard was cleared out. An audience from all over Akea had gathered in the courtyard. The food carts were already set up, and many had opened to offer their free samples to passing Akeans. The colorful dresses and shirts passed and danced in front of me like a long river of jubilation. Not even the heat prevented the high houses from donning several layers of courtly coats. Truly, posterity defined the Lord's values. To the right of the presentation stage, the big wooden basin was already set up, and there were several men pouring mounds of grapes into the basin. I started walking, and several merchants handed me samples of their trade, which I graciously declined. I had only one goal for today, and not even the beautiful silk dresses that the merchants brought and put on display could lead me astray from this. The festival was about to start, perhaps in an hour or two. This gave me exactly that much time to spend with Wind. I had to hurry. Lamare, I heard a familiar voice say. Dogen stood right in front of me, wearing what I could only presume was his best armor. The brass was polished to a shine, and the plumes on his helmet were all frolicking in the breeze, an oddly beautiful combination of orange and blue, the royal colors of House Amark. Dogen Randa, I said, smiling slightly. The soldier that was escorting me turned around and allowed Dogen to accompany me to Wind. The unmistakable noise of the celebration's preparations filled the air, even as I moved away from the palace yard and entered the lobby. The trumpets kept blaring, and the drums continued rolling as laughter mixed with shouts and the loud bickering trailed after me. The dancing in the yard, as a prelude to the festival, had started as well. How did it go with the emperor? I asked. Dogen smirked. It could have been worse, he said. The usual stuff, but he's too busy even to realize that I was gone for more than a day. The festival proved to be a convenient cover. When I reached the chamber doors, Dogen stopped in his tracks. Are you ready? He asked. I looked up at Dogen. Do I tell him? Could I trust him? I am, I said, with a little more conviction in my voice. I'll watch your back, he said before moving sideways to let me pass. Saul Douglas. This time, I would not let myself be caught. I tried to be angry so that the calmness that was my person would be shrouded. If I were calm, Wind would sense my presence because I was the only one who could calm him. I had to ask a servant to bring me several cups of diced bell peppers to disguise myself. When I had my first mouthful of it, my mouth burned and my eyes watered. My face grew hot, and my heart started to pound. Oh, the things I do for this man. The chamber that Wind used to receive Lamare had 2 entrances. The one was the main entrance where Dogen stood guard, while the other served as an adjoining entrance to a room which Wind called the war room. It was where he met with the war generals for strategies on occasions that there were uprisings in Akea. Today, it would still serve its purpose since I was hiding here to learn about the secret behind his meetings with Lamare. From a peephole, I could see Wind sitting on his throne. He was wearing the red robes, which the emperor put on for major festivities, like today when the moon's full turning would be celebrated. He seemed more impatient than usual. Well, there was nothing new there. He had always been the storm that was his namesake anyway. The door opened, bringing the royal scribe, Kino Amark, to my full view. Her hair was pulled back in a bun and not arranged in her usual braid nor worn hanging down in their loose waves. Dogen came in next, who closed the door behind him. "Your Grace," Kino said. Wind got up from his throne and swiped the scroll from Kino's hand. She was still curtsying in front of him. He opened the scroll and glanced at it from top to bottom as though he was searching for something. "Good, you completed the days," he said in a voice that was so chilling it cooled down my burning cheeks. Then he sat back on his throne. "You may rise," he said to Kino. Dogen was quick. As soon as Wind said those words, Dogen moved and brought a chair towards Kino, which she graciously accepted. It seemed like he was smiling at her. Was there something going on between these two? Now, what should I observe? There was nothing here. I wish they would talk so I could listen in on their conversation. Please, could somebody speak up? I wanted to yell at all of them. My head was in a rage, thank gods that the bell peppers worked. "What is this? Remove this line, this is preposterous," Wind said. Kino was immediately on her feet. "My apologies, Your Grace," she said meekly. "Is there anything in particular that you want me to say in this part?" she asked. "Oh, please, please, say something." "Let me remind you of the rules, Kino," he said. 1. I don't wish to spoil Akeans by raising the minimum wage. What good will it do? They will become lazy, Kino blanched. 2. There will be no repetition within a month. That was clear. Yet, you wrote about another flooding in Direla? Aren't you thinking anymore? "My apologies, Your Grace," she said. "I don't accept your apologies, correct the mistakes. Or do you really want to see your bastard son dead?" The retort caught my breath. That was harsh, and I could tell that it pierced Kino even more. Even that ugly soldier seemed to feel something stir in his chest because he frowned at the order. Wind should be careful of this soldier. Dogen may be his guard, but Dogen's loyalty could well belong to someone else. "It won't happen again, Your Grace," Kino said after a while. What was wrong with this picture? The last time Kino was here, she seemed to have grown courage, but now she was cowering again. None of this made any sense. What did Wind mean when he mentioned flooding in Direla? Especially when he said another flooding in Direla? "I don't have much time to spend on this." "Don't waste my time," Wind said. Kino nodded nervously. Dogen brought her a small desk. He opened the top panel and fished out an ink bottle and a feather pen. He moved in such an efficient manner that, to me, the scene seemed rehearsed. So, this was how the meetings went. Kino's hands were shaking as she edited the scroll. When she finished with the edits, she handed the scroll back to Wind. Wind read the scroll for 30 minutes, and there were no other sounds to be heard aside from the occasional shuffling of Dogen's feet. This was probably the most mundane spying I had ever done in my life. And yet, I could not crack the puzzle. What was so important about all of this? I rested my back on the wall and waited for movements inside the chambers. Nothing. I stretched my legs in front of me and slowly massaged my ankles. "Brilliant." Wind's voice boomed. I moved quickly towards the peephole again. Wind looked satisfied, and Kino looked as if she were to faint any minute. "The volcanoes of Karasthea are to erupt," Wind said, almost in reverence. "I never saw this coming, Kino." Kino was looking at him, secretly shooting daggers with her eyes. This was so frustrating that I wanted to tear at my flesh because I was itching to know why Wind would be ecstatic over the volcanoes that had not erupted in 1,000 years. Wind continued reading, and no other words were spoken. I sat back against the door and waited. Minutes passed until, from the bottom of the door, some sparks flew. There was also some reflection of burning light coming from under the chamber doors. I looked through the peephole and saw what Wind was doing. He was burning the scroll with a trifling amount of lightning shooting out of his fingertips. It touched the words that Kino wrote, scorching them. Why? I still did not understand. There were no clues except that Wind got mad when he asked Kino about the flooding in Direla. Then there was also the mention of the volcanoes erupting in Charisthea. These did not make sense. I watched as the last word burned. Even from where I was hiding, I could see the relief wash over Lamare's face. "By your leave, Your Grace," Lamare said. Wynne dismissed her with his hand, without even looking as she left his presence. "Dogen, call the guards. We will head to the palace yards. Let the golden bell toll. Announce my arrival," Wynne said. "As you wish, Your Grace," Dogen said, bowing halfway and then walking after Lamare. Lamare Amark. It was done. It was unbelievable. Wynne did not notice at all. My hunch was correct. By creating a fuss in the first part of the scroll, one that would surely catch his attention, other matters became irrelevant to him. As he went through the scroll, burning each word to make them real, my heart had started thumping wildly inside my chest. The gods must be smiling down on me. There were times that I felt like they had forsaken me, but not today. They granted my wish, and this was a cause for celebration. Now all I had to do was go home, pack our belongings, and take Kino with me to Nivedon in the soonest possible time. I saw Dogen as he left the chambers. He glanced my way once before heading out to call the palace guards. Soon he would go back inside to escort Wynne together with a dozen other guards. The carriage that brought me to the palace waited outside. It dawned on me. Since I presumed that Kino was now free and we were going to hide in Nivedon, then this was probably the last time that I would set foot in the Canellan Palace, in my home. Or what used to be my home. I turned around, already feeling nostalgic. I had to see it once again, in all its glory. The Canellan Palace stood high and majestic as it has always been, the flags of all the 14 lands fluttering in slow movements as the breeze blew. It was such a beautiful sight to take in. The palace was old, and the walls, for the most part, had been covered by vines. Regardless, their crawling tendrils only added to its majestic bearing, leaving anyone awed by its stability, by its strength. Old, sturdy trees lined the main sidewalks. Guards had been scattered all over the palace, and the main yard where the Akean wine festival was to be celebrated was now filled with Akeans, all waiting for the emperor to come out. They were waving tiny flags in high spirits, each bearing their own province's insignias. Today was certainly a day for celebration, not only for Kino and me but for the rest of Akeans as well. My eyes moistened from memories that the palace brought back. Oh, Father Northsum. I wished he were still here. I rubbed at the corner of my eyes to prevent the tears from falling. Lately, I would find myself crying too often. My throat was constricted from too many emotions burning inside my chest. I would not attend the festival anymore, but in my heart, I wished I could see it one last time. I turned towards the palace gates again. The soldier was waiting for me. He was holding the door of the carriage open. I smiled at him and tried to take a mental image of his face, something I could bring with me when I remembered this moment. Lamare Ariston Amark, Princess of Akea, descendant of the Amark bloodline, eldest of Northsum. I am not even honored in people's minds anymore, not even as a faint memory. The thought burns even as I prepare to leave. I took one step on the carriage ladder. I was about to take another one, but the noise from an oncoming carriage stopped me. 2 large carriages halted, and then the doors swung open. I saw Professor Levin as he descended the carriage. He faced the door and guided the students as, one by one, they descended. The last to come down was a boy dressed in a watermelon costume, my son's friend, Mayo Kalo. He had a hard time squeezing out of the carriage door. Finally, he managed to step off the carriage, and I breathed in relief. I stepped up the carriage and sat down, oblivious to the sound of the whips as they lashed at the horses. The carriage started moving. For memory's sake, I glanced back at the palace, at the wagons, and I caught a glimpse of a boy with a silver cape getting off the school's carriage. He turned around and ran after the watermelon boy, smiling. When I saw his face, my heart stopped beating. "Kino! Stop!" I yelled at the soldier who was driving the carriage I was riding. The wheels screeched as the carriage pulled to a stop. I pushed the door open and came out running after my boy. He was tall, so it would be easy to spot him, but the crowd had taken him in, and I had to tiptoe to see where I was going. I pushed and squeezed myself into the crowd, hoping I could get to Kino before my plan could be ruined. Piper San Diego. When I make sudden movements, the left side of my head still hurts. The wound had scabbed, and the fever had left, but running and brisk walking for several hours reminded me that I was not entirely healed. When I entered the palace grounds, I must admit, I was blown away. It was a good thing that I was invisible, because if I were not, Mayo and Kino would probably tease me about how widened my eyes were at the Canellan Palace's grandeur. It started when the carriage pulled to a stop. I looked outside the window and caught a glimpse of the crowd. There were so many people loitering about, wearing their best clothes. I felt a little out of place in my cotton shirt and pants. It was a good thing no one could see me. When my feet hit the paved paths that led to the palace, I felt a different sensation inside my chest. The excitement inside me was bursting, and I could not stop feeding my eyes with the impressive view. There seemed to be all sorts of Akeans here today. The mahogany-skinned people of the Akea Islands were on one side of the palace yards. I only identified them to be from the Akea Islands because of the flag that hovered above their seats. Opposite them, the light oak-skinned tall Minuans were seated well-behaved, with very little excitement to show. They must be a pretty dull bunch. I ignored the others because, by the time Mayo and I were halfway walking the path, the parade of peddlers had come into view. They were pushing carts that carried different delicacies. I guessed that the food they were offering the people also represented their province's food delights. The best part of it was that most of the food was free, and those that were not, Mayo bought with his gold coins. Mayo pulled at the costume, and I had to follow him wherever he went. He took 2 chewy berries dipped in thick cocoa, and I licked my lips in anticipation, thinking that he would give me the other one. Instead, he put both inside his mouth and took 2 more. Inside the costume, I pinched his side, and he yelped as I helped him remember me. "Oops, sorry. I forgot I had company," he said. Then he took another one, and when no one was looking, I took the chewy berry from his hand. Delicious. I looked at Kino, who was busily checking out the cart of drinks. He took 3 bottled drinks and handed one to Mayo, who was grinning at him. I assumed the other one was for me, but he was discreet, and he did not give it to me immediately. When we were lost again in the crowd, I managed to snatch the bottle from him. As soon as my hand touched the bottle, it turned invisible, and I drank heartily. Professor Levin motioned us to keep moving towards the presenters' seats, and I squeezed beside Mayo a little more. I looked around me one more time, marveling at the palace grounds. Whether my head throbbed in pain or not, the experience of being here, of being part of this world, was worth it. The Akean Wine Festival was the embodiment of the turning of the moons. No wonder Mayo was so excited to go. Fabulous was not even the correct term to describe how majestic the celebration was. The trumpets continued blaring. To the right side, I saw that the crowd parted as a group of people walked by. I caught sight of soldiers and wondered who could be heading towards the palace stage. A line of soldiers pushed the crowd forward and away from them, wearing their armor that shone even brighter than the newly minted coin I took from Kino. I loved it here in mainland Akea. I wished that the Nivens, not the ghosts, were once again a part of all of this.
Dogon Randa. Your Grace, I bowed in front of the Emperor. The palace guards are here. We may begin with the ceremony, at your command, I said. The Emperor didn't even acknowledge what I said. Instead, he started walking away. The soldiers took their positions and enclosed him in a circle. We were here to protect him, I guess. Up ahead, I saw a small woman making her way through the crowd. Lamare? What could she still be doing here? If her plan worked the way she told me that she'd readied for, then why was she still here? The crowd parted before us, and in a few minutes, we were already on stage. I took my position in front of the Emperor. Half of the soldiers did the same while the other half fell behind him. Now that I had donned my armor, I was back to being Dogon Randa, the Emperor's human armor, his personal guard. The other soldiers were wary, too. I could see it in their movements, in the way they scouted the area. They may not be moving, but their eyes were as sharp as an eagle's. Always on the lookout for trouble. In the crowd, the other palace soldiers were scattered, oblivious to any commotion, standing ready to pacify any outrage that may break out. The war generals who were still in Canella have also gathered around. The golden bell tolled, once, Twice, at the third time, it stopped. Everyone rose from their seats. Turan Aragar motioned forward and spoke. Dear Akeans, we are gathered today for the Akean Wine Festival. We welcome the turning of the moons, as do we these young people of the land who are bound to become citizens today. The golden bell tolled again. Only once this time. The emperor rose from his throne and gestured to the women on his right. They knelt in front of him, and then one by one, they removed the cloaks that covered them. 14 scantily clothed women hopped into the wooden basin to dance atop the grapes so that their feet could crush the fruits. They would dance until the ceremony was over. The only things that changed in the crushing of the grapes were the women's dresses. They used to wear sheer flowing white robes, but ever since Wind was declared the emperor, the dresses became more revealing, the cloth stopping inches above the maiden's knees. The sleeves of the dresses were removed, and the remaining fabric left little to the imagination. The emperor bellowed, "The moons have completed their turns, and Akeans have once again been claimed. With a new set of extraordinary blood, Akea will never bleed. Time turns. There will be challenges ahead." At that moment, the emperor continued, and I listened. The words he uttered were the same as many festivals before, as old as Akea itself, for it was a tradition. When he was finished with the opening ceremony, the palace staff guided the crowd and motioned for them to sit down. Everybody did, as ordered. Turan, the emperor's advisor, stepped forward. And now, what we have all been waiting for, the presentation of Akea's children, to be honored as citizens. The drums rolled, the trumpets blared, and the golden bell tolled. The festival had officially begun. A girl wearing a sundress and a straw hat walked forward from the crowd and bowed down. The emperor nodded at her to signal her to begin her presentation. The girl danced around a small area, lifting her arms in the air, and spinning on her toes. She then bent down and picked up the hoe. She danced again, repeating the steps, but this time holding the hoe with both hands. At the end of the steps, she threw down the hoe and cracked the ground open. The crowd went silent, all waiting for what she would do next. Then the girl lifted her hands and showed the emperor the seeds she was holding while dancing the exact steps that she performed earlier. At the end of her dance, she threw the seeds and patted the ground. The dancing went on for another minute, and it became monotonous. I guess the crowd got bored too because they started to make noise again. But then the girl ended her dance differently this time. She tapped her toes in front of her, making rhythmic sounds, and then as she clicked her heels together, in one fluid motion, she bent sideways and pointed to where she had put the seeds. The crowd fell so silent that I swear I could almost hear the little girl's breathing as she stopped dancing. The most amazing thing happened next. The seeds started to sprout, and when they were a foot tall, they stopped growing. The girl was beaming as the crowd rallied and cheered. "Nicola Gaskin, Your Grace," she said. "A resident of Canella, Hollow Village." She knelt and waited for the emperor to nod before she stood up and went to the bookkeeper maintaining the registry of citizens. She was now officially a citizen. Next came a boy. There was no lavish display of his power. He stood in front of us and sang. It was the most beautiful voice I heard, and the crowd fell silent again. He was from Akea Islands. Hundreds of children came here today to register their powers. This would go on for a few more days. Kino Amark. From where I was sitting, I could see all the children displaying their powers. I had forgotten how grand it was to witness the Akean Wine Festival. When I was younger and still believed that a special ability could develop in me, I wished that it would be a good one, something I could be proud of. I even promised the gods that I would not boast about my power when it came if they would give me a quite fantastic one. I used to dream that I could be one who could fly. That maybe, the dragon would be reborn in me. A foolish dream, I know. But it was a dream that brought me hope nonetheless. As the moon turns went by, I neared the age for presentation as a citizen, and I started losing hope. No day passed that I did not pray to the gods to grant me any power. This time, I did not demand great power. Anything would do. But still, it did not come. So I stopped going to the festival. I was mad at the gods for cursing me without a power. It's terrible to be envious of others, but I couldn't help it. Even now, sitting here beside Mayo and Piper, I knew that my being here was a sham, and if ever I got caught, this humiliation would be worse than being taunted for not having any power at all. But as Mayo pointed out, Mother and I would run away soon, so I tried hard to shrug the feeling off. Mayo stood up and pressed the button on his belt. "I have to go," he said. "I'll be next." It meant that he was letting Piper out of his costume. The girl who presented was from Amer, and the crowd erupted in cheers as she made paper planes fly and roamed the palace yards for almost 3 minutes. It was pretty amazing. "Excuse me," Mayo said as he moved forward. To my left, Piper pressed against me so she would not occupy a lot of space. I squeezed her hand so that in case she was nervous, she would know that we were in this together. She squeezed my hand back. Mayo knelt in front of the Emperor and started moving around. He jiggled his costume, so it shook erratically. The crowd laughed. Then from one of the holes of the watermelon costume, an apple fell. "Oops," he said. Then he picked it up and closed his eyes. Right in front of us, the red apple turned purple. He bit it. As juicy as ever, but no bad components. "What bad components?" the crowd murmured. "Bad components that can make people fat?" someone from the crowd yelled. Laughter filled the courtyard, and Mayo blushed. He continued his jiggling until, this time, a pear fell. He did the same and then bit it. When he finished, he said in a loud voice, "Mayo Kalo, Your Grace. From Canella, Torona village." The Emperor moved forward on his throne. "Kalo?" "Yes, Your Grace," Mayo said. "You are General Kalo's son?" This time, Mayo beamed. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. "Too bad he isn't around to watch your shameful power on display," the Emperor bellowed. The crowd went still. If ever any among us did not like what he said, and I was pretty sure a lot of us did not, nobody reacted negatively to what the Emperor said. Mayo blushed as he bowed down again and walked towards the book. "Keeper." "I'm sorry about that," Piper whispered in my ear. "Me too," I said. Mayo Kalo. I was glad my presentation was over. Even if the crowd laughed at me, I believe that they felt sorry for me too because the Emperor mocked me at the end of the performance. Why was he so cruel? Yes, my father was never as proud of my power, but I was sure he would never find it shameful, especially once I became a war general like him. Kino looked at me from the corner of his crazy eye, but I did not turn to look at him. He was wondering if I was all right, I guess. I would be. Besides, nobody here, except for my classmates, would remember my presentation since hundreds of us did a presentation. "You can stop looking at me now." "I'm fine," I said. Kino smiled. "Good." He was watching the girl in front of the crowd as she presented her power. "It's wonderful, you know," he said. "Your power is so unique, it will have a good use in the future." "Oh, shut up," I said dismissively. I pouted and watched the little girl. I hated it when Kino patronized my power. When the girl's presentation was over, a court servant signaled for Kino to stand up. I looked at him and saw him gulp. He was nervous, I presumed, and he had every right to be. He had no power, and this was just a sham that we concocted, to dupe the Emperor, no less. "Wish me luck," Kino whispered as he reached for the box. "To stop the bullying," I returned, then raised my clenched fist in the air to show him my support. The crowd moved aside to let him pass, and soon he was at the center holding the box that Piper gave him. I could not see where Piper was, but I was sure that she would never leave Kino behind.
Kino Amark. When Mayo presented, I knew where I would find Kino, beside Mayo. And sure enough, after Mayo's presentation, he made his way through the crowd and sat beside Kino. Now all I had to do was to go where my son was and pull him out. I was only a few rows back, and it would still take me a few more minutes to get to him. The crowd had not thinned since the celebration started, and if I was not mistaken, it had grown thicker instead. My training in the palace told me that I could not make sudden, overt movements lest the guards mistake me for an assassin. I cannot risk that. It was bad enough that I was still in the palace grounds. When I was near Kino, to my surprise, he stood up and made his way through the crowd, clutching a box. What was he doing? Was he going to present himself? But how? He was unaware that the bond holding his power was broken. Did he get a weird sensation that something changed? And yet, he could not have known that I was about to release him from the bond. He does not even know about the bond. Kino knelt in front of Wind, and my heart thudded loudly. I could not bear to watch this. But I had to see what in God's name's Kino would do. He put the wooden box down and stepped away from it. The crowd waited patiently for what he would do next. "Box, I command you to float," Kino said. Then he raised his right arm upwards. To his front, the box wobbled, lifted in the air slightly, wobbled some more, and then it fell to the ground. The crowd roared in laughter. Kino's face flushed, and he said again, "Float. Float higher." Then he raised his hand higher, and the box rose in the air. This time, the crowd went silent. Then altogether, as though the crowd was just one person, they cheered. This power was Distantekis. No one had displayed this power in more than 50 moon turns. The last one who presented such power was Elder Tala. After that, nobody else did, for it was such a rare gift. My eyes widened in disbelief. Even the palace guards were looking at Kino closely now. I wanted to vanish at that moment and take Kino with me. To my horror, Wind leaned forward on his throne, which was a bad sign because it meant that he was intrigued, and later on, when Kino mentions his name, it would only mean chaos. "Stir," Kino said. Then as he raised both arms, the box floated. He moved his hands alternately as though he was juggling, and the box moved as though it was being juggled to the right and then to the left. It was such a fantastic sight. Kino stopped his hands in midair, and the box became still as it hung suspended in the air. The crowd gasped in unison. I looked around for any safe place where I could quickly grab my son and pull him out of all this havoc. Dogen was watching Kino with wide eyes. He knew that Kino had no power. I moved quickly to my right, squeezing myself through the crowd, pushing myself towards the nook where the bookkeeper was seated. Once the presentation was over, Kino would go there to register his name. My eyes met Dogen's, and he looked as shocked as I was. Perhaps he saw how scared I was. Still, he nodded curtly at me. I prayed that the presentation would end sooner than not. I could not bear to watch this any further. I continued squeezing myself towards the bookkeeper. "Box, I want you to jump," Kino said as he threw his hands up in the air. The box floated upwards and fell to the ground. Finally, Kino lifted his right hand. The box rose too. It swayed as it remained afloat. Kino pulled his hand backward and the box moved towards him. When it was inches above his palm, it stopped. "Drop," Kino said. The box fell on his hands, and he raised the box as he eyed the audience. His eyes were shining. He smiled at the spectators and lifted the wooden box again for everyone to see. The crowd cheered louder. My son was beaming. I had never seen him look this happy before, and my heart broke at this realization. After a few moments, he threw the box upwards, raising it in the air for about 10 yards. It started falling fast, and when it was only 2 feet from the ground, the wooden box stopped, suspended in the air. All around me, the crowd went wild. Kino waved his hand downwards, and sure enough, the box fell to the ground. Finally, I reached the bookkeeper, busily copying Kino's name from the presenter's list and scribbling it down in the Akean books. The bookkeeper's brows were in a knot as though he was confused. From where I was, I could grab Kino, and afterward, we would be scampering for our lives. I was wrong. I thought that the gods were favoring me today, but no, they had deserted me. I stood here ready, hoping to run away with my son.
McQuinstorm Aaron. This one boy drove the crowd crazy, and while I watched him, only one thought ran through my head: I had to make sure that his allegiance to the palace would never waver. He could never go against me because if rebels exploited his strength, the palace could have even more factions. I may be able to tame him for a while, but the gods only know what he might think later on.
What if he becomes ambitious enough to want to rule Akea?
If that happens, I will kill him. Write him off Akean books. His power was still weak. He could move small objects now, but I was sure it would develop in the next moon turns. Elder Tala was only able to make ants line up on the ground with his power when he presented, and look at him now, a powerful ally to my rule. I leaned forward as soon as the crowd grew silent.
Before the boy could speak, I asked him in my coldest voice, "What is your name?"
I'm Kino, your grace. He paused. Kino Amark. From Wawang village, he said. Kino Amark. My eyebrows shot up, but I refrained from showing any more emotion on my face.
Amark?
Yes, your grace, he said.
Who is your mother?
I asked. Already my heart started to beat fast.
Had my former wife tricked me into releasing the bond? Did I burn words that would allow her bastard to become a citizen of Akea?
I looked around for any conspicuous movements in the crowd to try and spot Lamare, but I could not find her. She was a small woman, and looking for her in a crowd as large as this proved difficult. I glanced at the bookkeeper and saw him writing on the Akean book. That lazy old man. I told him not to write the names until after I had given my blessings to the presenters.
But the bookkeeper seemed to be striking out entries on the registry, his face seemingly confused. Then he raised his hand that was holding a quill and scratched his head.
Lamare Amark, your grace, the boy said once again. I closed my eyes, terrified at the revelation. What did I burn in the scrolls?
Why was he released from the bond?
There was nothing different in the scrolls.
There were disasters that I told Lamare to write down, horrid things I made her edit.
All in my favor. But what about the closing of the scroll?
Did she write them differently?
She always ended each scroll with,
"And my son, Kino, is as he always is, never a citizen of Akea, land of extraordinary powers."
That ensured that her son would live but without power, just as Lamare and I had agreed. What did she write? I was distracted by the festival. I thought there was something odd in what she wrote. But I could not remember.
I opened my eyes, and I saw everybody looking at me as if waiting for what I would say next, expecting nothing more than my usual blessings to the children.
Then looking at the crowd, at each face of the citizens, at their ordinary faces that did not deserve to be standing in my presence, it came to me, and my son Kino is as he always is, an ordinary boy, not a citizen of Akea, land of extraordinary powers. She tricked me. Being ordinary in Akea meant that you would develop power because that was what ordinary meant in this land.
Not being a citizen now meant that at some point, he could very well be.
She tricked me into releasing his bond by playing with her words. My face took on a vengeful rage as fury welled in my chest and storm clouds gathered above me.
I raised my right hand and pointed at Kino.
The crowd whispered in hushed tones upon seeing that the storm clouds were all of a sudden looming down upon us. Kill him, I ordered the palace guards in my coldest tone.
Piper San Diego. I gasped when I heard the Emperor's order, but nobody seemed to have heard because the crowd had also gasped upon hearing the command. If anybody could see me, they could testify that I went paler than my already gray skin. I could not move. What do we do now? I looked around. Nobody was moving. The soldiers were all dumbfounded as well. Seconds passed while Kino and I stood in front of the Emperor. Time seemed to freeze, and it felt like forever. But the soldiers started edging forward. After all, what was the rush? The one in front of them was just a boy. I only wanted to stop the bullying of Kino's classmates, but dear gods, did I bring death upon my friend? A woman to our right shouted, "Kino!" She yelled. Kino and I turned at the same time. I did not know the woman, but someone wailing in the background, displaying so much worry over Kino, could only be his mother, Mistress Lamare. She was pushing against a group of soldiers to get to where we were, although with a crowd this thick, it seemed an impossible feat. The Emperor was now standing, glaring at Kino, never taking his eyes off him. I did not understand his hatred, but his eyes were burning with a rage so intense that it terrified me to the core. So I did what I do best. I reached out and grabbed Kino's hand and shared with him my power. In the blink of an eye, he was invisible. "What are we going to do?" he asked, panicked. "Run," I said. The soldiers were stunned. The Emperor cursed. And that was when all hell broke loose. "Behind him, you fools!" the Emperor shouted. "Mother?" Kino said. "We have to get to Mother." I grasped his hand firmly, afraid that our connection would be broken. Lightning shot out from the sky, and the rumbling of thunder followed. I ran faster, hoping to reach Mistress Lamari sooner. She was still fighting her way through the crowd, trying to get to where Kino had vanished. Only a few yards now, and we would be beside her. If only I could make her invisible too. But I could only make one person invisible at a time. Kino and I kept on running. Then, to my amazement, before we reached Mistress Lamare, the soldiers guarding her tumbled down as though people were pushing at them. All around her, the crowd parted. This was the time that I noticed the gooey figures surrounding us. "Piper, run," I heard a familiar voice say. "Kogi," I shouted. "Yes. Be quick. We'll hold the guards down," he said. Then, to my horror, a burly man riding a horse scooped Mistress Lamare and galloped away. "Mother?" Kino shouted. "No." He pulled me to run after Mistress Lamare. I glanced all around me. "Kogi, please take Watermelon Boy. He's a friend," I shouted and only hoped Kogi heard me. "Got it. See you at the secret passage," Kogi yelled. "Yes," I shouted even though I was unsure if he still heard me. Kino was now sprinting, and my short legs could only do so much to keep up with him. "Wait," I said, panting in between steps. The ground behind us erupted violently as lightning struck. Suddenly we were thrown upwards. Kino's hands tightened against mine, but the force was so strong that our hands lost connection. "Kino!" I shouted. I landed with a loud thud on the ground, and the pain that shot up my arm made me lose control over my power. The crowd had thinned. Dead bodies lay everywhere. I cringed when I saw a child's face peering at me through her glazed eyes. I struggled to stand up, and before I looked for Kino, I closed the girl's dead eyes. A straw hat was lying beside her. I shivered. "Piper!" Kino shouted. I turned around and saw him several yards away. The soldiers found him too. I raced towards Kino, reeling in urgency to get to him first. Kino started running towards me, and before the soldiers could take him, I had touched his hand, and we vanished together in the air. "Run," I said. "Faster, Piper." "Dogen took my mother," he said in anguish. My heart thudded. Did Mayo and Kogi survive the explosion? I prayed they did. All around us, the soldiers fell. I doubted if any Akean was able to figure out what was happening. They were unaware that their so-called ghosts were at the palace, shoving people away, clearing our path to redemption. I ran as fast as I could and hoped that I would not get in trouble with my father. Highly unlikely. How did he find out where I was? The left side of my head started throbbing, but we did not have a luxury to stop and rest. Saul Douglas. The commotion erupted all around me, and I ran, pulling my skirt up, to get to where Wind was. Do I calm the crowd, or do I pacify Wind? He was raging mad now, and lightning had begun to strike Canella. More bolts of lightning shot from the sky without another warning, hitting the palace yards and sending explosions in the courtyard. The crowd shrieked, and in minutes, hundreds of Akeans lay dead. Thunder roared unendingly, but the incessant wailing of the crowd muted it. Everywhere I looked, Akeans were running, shrieking, grabbing loved ones as they raced away from the main courtyard. Palace soldiers were pacifying the people, but there were so many of them who were panicking. I doubt if the soldiers could even quieten them at this point. The children ran around like headless chickens, their professors trying to provide some guidance by leading them away from the stage. All this havoc was because Wind ordered to kill a boy. More lightning struck the presentation yard, and another assortment of bodies, soldiers, spectators, children, went flying everywhere. My dress was now drenched in blood. I had to act quickly. When another explosion hit the earth, I was thrown back to the stage and landed near Wind. In front of me, I stared at the mangled bodies and torn limbs, and I fought the urge to throw up. I turned to look at where Kino last stood. He was gone. Then I felt Wind's rage reaching an unbelievable height. He was looking at someone, his eyes fixed and menacing. I followed his gaze and saw Lamare. The tiny woman was fighting the soldiers around her, and yet one by one, the soldiers fell down as though invisible hands were pushing at them. I did not understand what I was seeing. Everything was happening so fast. Then a hulking figure scooped Lamare up onto his horse and galloped away, leaving fallen soldiers behind them. I cursed the bell peppers for clouding my thoughts. I have never been this distraught. Always my calm persona has allowed me to make the right decisions. Now I watched as disaster exploded all around me. It grew misty, and I found Wind summoning the clouds. He was going to ride after them. But what for? Did he intend to kill Lumare? Why? She has always been so obedient. It was just the scrolls. If my memory serves me correctly, she only wrote things that he asked of her. The clouds started to gather around Wind's feet, and any minute now, he would rise into the air to pursue Lumare. Soon the clouds began to thicken, gradually condensing. I could not dally any longer. This was my only chance. I could not let the man I loved murder anyone anymore, even if it meant wounds crisscrossing my back, which happens every time I calmed Wind. Finding my ounce of courage, I threw myself at Wind, summoning all the calmness that I could take in. I pressed myself against his back, transferring all the calmness, good memories, and beautiful moments we had shared. He struggled against me, and I felt like my back was being hit by 1,000 whips, burning with each lash, but I could not let him kill anyone else, not after all this carnage. I screamed as the whips kept on coming, striking stronger against my back. No, he shouted. Wind went limp in my arms. Then there was nothing left that held us together. Wind and I fell to the ground,